Assalamu alaikum and hello, Dhoruba. We are connected with Dhoruba bin Wahad in Atlanta, Georgia, USA. Hello, how are you?
I'm fine, Marcus. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Greetings to everyone.
Thank you very much. First, I want to make a short introduction of you, Dhoruba, for our audience. Dhoruba bin Wahad was born in 1944 in the USA. He is a writer, activist, political analyst, former member of the Black Panther Party. As a field secretary, he was responsible for organizing chapters throughout the East Coast. He was founding member of the Black Liberation Army. For his activities, he went to prison in 1971 and spent 19 years in prison. He, his teams of lawyers and supporters were able to bring a lawsuit against the New York Department of Corrections. In 1990, he was released from prison after 19 years of torture, defamation, and isolation. When he came out from prison, he continued his work where he was stopped 19 years ago, before, but under total different political and social circumstances. Until today, the US fight a hybrid war against all kinds of black liberation on all levels. 2018, we, Dar al Janub, got the great opportunity to invite Dhoruba bin Wahad for a lecture in Vienna. And of course, the racist institutions in Austria, especially the board of the University of Vienna and the official student union called ÖH, couldn't accept a black man and a Muslim voice. But with the support from different directions, Dhoruba bin Wahad held his lectures in Vienna. Dhoruba bin Wahad will come again to Vienna on the 1st of October 2020. Second, we want to mention that during we talk here, black activists are still in prison in the United States. If we would ignore this fact, we would ignore the history. And without history, there is no future. The prisoners are our history. Third, we want to mention that this talk with Dhoruba bin Wahad is not a journalistic talk or an expert talk. We are not objective. We in Dar al Janub are not neutral. The following talk meets not the criteria of neutrality. So, Dhoruba, thank you for spending time with us. I want to ask the first question for our audience. Was the wave of protest that broke out after the lynching of George Floyd through a US killer cop to be expected? Which political, social groups were involved in these protests? Which possibilities contains this wave of protest? And what weaknesses are there? What is the meaning of the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement in this context?
Well, first of all, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent and Merciful, I want to say, Marcus, that yes, this wave of protests and spontaneous rebellions was expected. It was long overdue, in fact. And there is a long history, a long, consistent history of police murder, torture, and brutality of African people in the United States. This applies as well to brown people and to native indigenous peoples, the latter of whom the European settlers practically exterminated in the conquest of North America. For instance, in the Caribbean, the Caribbean islands, an entire people, the Carib people, natives of that land, of that place, were completely wiped out in less than 20 years after Christopher Columbus, quote, discovered the Caribbean. The current uprising, though, of young Africans, white and brown protesters, is different from previous radical and anti-racist spontaneous rebellions in that this historical movement is radically different than the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, even the somewhat militant 70s. Each of these eras, Marcus, had its own internal dynamics and external conditions that colored the public discourse and influenced the resistance of people to capitalism's domestic and foreign policies. As you know, in the 50s and the 60s, the United States was involved in the so-called Cold War. And everything that the United States did internationally and domestically was influenced by its confrontation with the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, and its opposition to the rise of China as a new regional and industrial power. The major problem today, however, is that young activists on the streets who are manning the barricades, and righteously so, against white supremacy and militarized policing, have little memory or connection to their radical and revolutionary struggles that preceded them. While the institutions of the state and government and the ruling oligarchs have institutional memory and know exactly what they think they need to do now. And this is why this fascist movement is fraught with unprecedented danger and unprecedented opportunities. This is also why the impact of technology on mass movements, spontaneous anti-fascist violence, and democratic reforms is significant. And technology has influenced this younger generation to the extent where they do not understand that technology is both an asset and a detriment to mass organization. We have a lot of spontaneous uprisings and mass mobilization, but very little organization. And I think it's very important for folks to understand that that the idea of Black Lives Matter as a hashtag movement is directly a result of young people, young activists, and especially young reformers, because you have to remember the individuals that coined the title hashtag Black Lives Matter were not revolutionaries. They were not radicals in the sense that they did not have a cogent political analysis and opposition to white supremacy and its connection to capitalism and international finance capitalism and imperialism. And this is a major weakness of these young people out on the streets today. They have no connection to their radical history and radical tradition. And so therefore they have a limited understanding of what fascism can be, how it emerged, and how it historically has been present in the United States for over 75 years. I think that we should really understand that fascism is nothing new in America as far as Black people are concerned, and that this neo-fascist movement that we're in is in fact unique. And so the major shortcomings of these hashtag movements is that they're about to reinvent failure. They're about to reconstitute co-optation. And that's what's happening now in the United States. They're being co-opted, they're being marginalized, and they're being demonized by the state. So we have to pay significant, I'm sorry, we have to, I'm finished. We have to pay particular attention to the nature of and the class aspects of these movements.
Okay, thank you. This would lead to our next question. The reducing of repression, racism, and impoverishment of the people on the person of Donald Trump is supposed to bring us in the next few months the candidates Joe Biden and Kamala Harris see as an alternative. You said Biden-Harris are more dangerous than Trump because they share an ideology and follow a plan. Can you explain that to us?
Well, as a number of activists on the left here, Black activists and Black and white intellectuals on the left have noted this, that choosing between disaster and catastrophe is not a choice. Choosing the enemy you think you can influence versus the enemy that you know you can't influence is both ideologically and intellectually unprincipled and dishonest. From the point of view of establishing a new political paradigm of government based on the needs of people and the advancement of economic equity and global development of this planet's human population, it is impossible. It is, in fact, unprincipled and unconscionable for anyone on the left to choose between two evils, to postulate that we can influence one as opposed to the other. Joe Biden has a long history of white supremacy and supporting racist legislation, anti-Black legislation. He was one of the major architects of mass incarceration. Kamala Harris is a born again pig. She's been a prosecutor for most of her career. She was an opportunist that arrived at that post as a result of a liaison between a glib politician, the mayor of San Francisco, and she had a personal relationship to him, and he put her in the positions to rise to the top of the state as California's attorney general. And she's never prosecuted any law enforcement personnel for murder or egregious behavior. She's always opposed reforms and release of political prisoners. So Kamala Harris is ideal for the empire. Neither one of these individuals are beneficial to our cause, to the people's cause, to the development of true democracy. We have to understand that if we are sincere in our opposition to fascism, if we are sincere in fighting for equitable redistribution of wealth globally, if we are sincere about saving this planet from the ravages of capitalist exploitation and imperialism, then we have to maintain our course. We have to maintain our analysis that there is no such thing as a lesser of two evils. They're both evil. We have to reimagine our economic livelihood. We have to reimagine policing in our community. And we have to persist in this intellectual honesty in order to bring about a new change and a change in the status quo. So it's not sufficient for us to say that we will vote for a Biden-Harris ticket versus a Trump-Pence ticket. And neither one are acceptable. And we should think in terms of how do we create a grassroots mass political party that can challenge the paradigms of power of these two institutional parties that work in the service of corporate finance capital and the wealthy. It's not just sufficient to talk about reform. We have to talk about abolition.
Okay, thank you. Some journalists in Austria are currently praising the great success of the New Jersey police, which apparently was able to drastically reduce the deadly confrontations with the people. Some think it is possible to reduce racist police violence with more black people or more Muslims in the police. Can you tell us about your experience with the police in general, and please say something about the New Jersey police and the role of the police unions in the US?
The New Jersey Police Department and the New Jersey state troopers and the New Jersey law enforcement in general are one of the most racist police departments on the planet in the United States. In fact, my comrade Shakur was brutally shot and ambushed by the New Jersey police. And my comrade Zaid Malik Shakur was killed in that incident. Sundiata Acoli, who's a political prisoner, he's in his late 80s. He's been in prison since 1973. And he's been consistently denied parole. Assata Shakur was placed on the US government's 10 most wanted terrorist list several years ago at the behest of the New Jersey Police Union, who felt that Obama's rapprochement to Cuba near the end of his term would somehow sanction the political exile of Assata Shakur. She's presently in exile in Cuba. So if we compare the New Jersey Police Department and the New Jersey law enforcement with law enforcement in New York, we would see that there's a symbiotic relationship, because the Port of New York, one of the largest ports in the United States on the East Coast, which handles almost 60% of all of the trade and shipping in and out of the United States on the East Coast, is controlled by an agency called the New York Port Authority, New Jersey Port Authority. And this is the combined institution. This is an institution that combines law enforcement on both the New Jersey and the New York side of the Hudson River. In New Jersey, several years ago, about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, Ras Baraka, who was the son of Amiri Baraka, the well-known poet and writer and activist in the 60s, was elected as an independent candidate to the mayor of Newark. And immediately he because he came up in the grass, came up in the community, he advocated community control of police. He advocated community residential residency clauses for police, that the police should live in the Black community that they police, that the police should live in the communities and be part of the communities that they were policing. This was vehemently opposed by the police union. They said, and this can be looked up, they said that this was an absurd form of anti-police politics because the people in the Black community and the African community hated the police. And how could you ask policemen to work in a community, to live in a community where they were hated? Well, there's a reason why the police in the Newark and New Jersey community hate the police, because the police have had a history of murder, brutality, and intimidation, and the courts have backed these policies. The Newark Police Department has been integrated for the past 25, 30 years. They have had Black law enforcement personnel in their agency for years. I believe that over 30% of the police in New Jersey are Black. But we notice that wherever there's a large Black population and there's a large representation of Black or brown police officers, the police officers in these agencies inevitably have to form their own union to look out for their own interests, because the regular union, the white-dominated union, very seldom looks out for the interests of policemen of color. They discriminate against policemen of color. They're discriminated against in terms of promotion, in terms of assignments and responsibility. So having more Black faces in high places in the police department will not change anything. In fact, if we look at the record, the recent murders that have come to light and killings of Black people in Baltimore, in Chicago, in New York, in Newark, and around the country, had Black police chiefs. The police chief in these agencies were Black, and in some cases, the mayors, in most of the cases, the mayors were people of color, were Black also. So having Black faces in high places changes nothing in terms of the paradigm of policing, in terms of the institution of policing. Police are not workers. They are not people who just punch in every day and do a 9-to-5 job and go home and draw a paycheck. The police are the armed agents of the state. They enjoy a special relationship to power that no other workers have. So the police union that protects them has become increasingly political and involved in policing in the communities where we live. And this has to stop. So the real move right now is not to integrate the police and provide them with better training. If we notice that these training programs, these sensitivity programs, wearing body cameras, have all been in effect while this recent spate of police murders have occurred. So that's not going to change the attitudes of police. That's not going to change the institution of policing, because the attitudes of police and the institution of policing are based in white supremacy, and is based in the white supremacist social construct of the United States. And so in order to change that paradigm, we have to talk about the abolishment of policing as it's presently constituted. We have to talk about a criminal justice system that is restorative rather than punitive. We have to talk about changing the command and control structure of police and removing it from the political hands of right-wing and left-wing politicians and putting it directly into the hands of people that are being subject to the policing. So none of these reforms that we are looking at today will mean anything, even if we were just to address the disparity of race in the police department. The police departments will still remain the major instrument of repression of the state. used by the rich, used by the state to control the public and to intimidate and terrify people of color. And finally, I would like to say that we need to understand, and I suggest that people in Austria really delve into the origins of the police in the United States. The historical origins of the police in the United States is rooted in white supremacy and slavery. The police have evolved from a system of where black bodies were considered property, where chattel slavery was considered the law of the land, and they were legally constituted to maintain that system. And this attitude that our bodies are property of the status quo, of white people, of white ownership, of status quo ownership, is why policemen feel it's free to abuse, murder, and brutalize black bodies. So the idea that Black Lives Matter is a protest, is a spontaneous protest to this paradigm of policing. However, we need to understand that in racist America, white people never had any idea that black people's lives and their bodies were somehow sacred to them, or somehow worthy of treatment, the same type of treatment that they would like. So Black Lives Matter as a hashtag is a plea to recognize black humanity. And I think as a revolutionary that it's a futile plea. I think as a revolutionary, it's begging the oppressor not to oppress you. I think that this is one of the reasons that Black Lives Matter as a hashtag, as a movement, will ultimately wind up as a co-opted movement supporting the democratic or neoliberals of today. And I think that if we look in Austria and in Europe, as I've been following and listening to some of your analysis, that the Black Lives Matter in Europe has aligned themselves with proto-Zionists and reactionary forces in Europe in order to protest the policing of the state. They have nothing to do whatsoever with any type of notion or concept that policing is an expression of capital and is an instrument of capitalism to repress and destroy and weaken the working class.
Okay, thank you, Dhoruba. Maybe the next question is obsolete, but I will ask again, can the slogan "defund the police" be a solution if we look at the racist history of the police and in the US settler empire? Does the problem of institutional racism have anything to do with police equipment or budget, or does the reason lies in the political and ideological concept of the USA?
No, defund the police is a meaningless emotional response to police brutality and the vivid illustration of police racism in the United States. So defunding the police will not achieve anything. I mean, you take a police department like Los Angeles Police Department, that has several $billion in funds available to them. There are special relationships between the U.S. military so that the police can get training and surplus military equipment from the U.S. military. And just taking a few $1 million or even a third of the budget and putting it into daycare or social programs in the Black community will not change the relationship of the police to the community. It will not change the nature of policing in the community. They'll still have, if they got $6 billion budget, they'll still have $5 billion after you take $1 billion away from them. So defunding the police is meaningless. It's an instrument of deception. It's used by neoliberals to create the perception that reform of policing police in America is possible. You cannot reform the United States Police Department. You have to abolish it. You cannot reform this because the police, as they're presently constituted, are a crucial instrument of domestic control of fascism. They're an integral instrument of state corporate fascism. If we look at the rise of fascism historically has always arisen from the right, and it has always employed or co-opted and used the domestic police to enforce that paradigm of corporate state power. So no, you cannot defund the police and expect any significant change in policing. And as far as the political and ideological concept of policing in America, yes, fascism requires a militarized domestic police force. It has always required this. If we remember the rise of the brown shirts in Nazi Germany, the police before the rise of the brown shirts in Nazi Germany were basically apolitical. The domestic police were basically apolitical. But Hitler had to quote, deputize his brown shirts, make his brown shirts the institutional center for policing, and domestic police had to fall into place. The U.S. is trying to do something like this in terms of homeland security and in terms of the U.S. presidency being the major bully pulpit for law and order. But in the United States, unlike in most countries, the United States does not have a national police force. So therefore, the president of the United States really can't control or direct local law enforcement. He can only direct and control federal law enforcement. And federal law enforcement has to deal with the authority and the sovereignty of each state. So this being the case in the US, we have a unique form of fascism that is evolving. This is why I've used the term democratic fascism. Because we have the delusion or the illusion of democracy while we have the economic and political reality of fascism. And the police are key in maintaining this balance. So the reason why the US police are being given military grade equipment, surplus equipment from the military, is because of the history of radical rebellion and revolutionary struggle in the United States, stretching back all the way to the days of Paul Robeson. Fascism is not new in the U.S. Around this time in 1949, Paul Robeson, who admired the Soviet Union at that time, the Communist Party at that time, their socialist agenda of the equality of working class people, he was scheduled to do a concert in Peekskill, New York, in 1949. And it was attended mainly by leftists and Jewish supporters of the Soviet Union and of the left and the Communist Party in the U.S. This concert was brutally broken up by the police and a mob of fascists screaming, kill the nigger, hang him, kill the Jewish kike, run him out of the country, and these were fascists. They had Nazi insignias. They were fascists. So fascism, Paul Robeson spoke out against this, about fascism in the United States, and said he was an anti-fascist. And he would be an anti-fascist if fascism reared its ugly head in the US, if it's reared its ugly head in Europe, or even if it's reared its ugly head in the Soviet Union. And he was anti-fascist. And he took that position. And I think we need to understand this position today, that the militarized police are a phenomenon, are a result of the national security state, which has become the model of government around the world, this national security state that views the people, all of the people, as potential terrorists and most of the people of color as potential criminals. So the militarization and the arming of the police is going to remain and continue until we abolish policing and the attitude of policing as it's presently constituted. I don't believe we can do that without a radical change of the class structures of Western society.
Thank you, Dhoruba. Thank you. The next question is the lynching of George Floyd has also mobilized many people in Europe. Apparently, apolitical unrest in cities such as Stuttgart, Frankfurt, or Berlin could also be assessed in this context. In the course of the deepening crisis in the world economy, the people showed the police, which were becoming increasingly brutal and racist, the limits. In Vienna, The Social Democratic Party, which is responsible for neoliberal politics and the establishment of institutional racism for decades, mobilized for the so-called Black Lives Matter rally. Those circles that prevented your lecture in 2018 at the university were also the organizers. Last week, activists of the BDS movement were attacked by so-called Antifas, racist white groups, in an alleged anti-racist demonstration. Tell us something about the experiments of the institutions to channel the protests, and do you have a message to these attacked BDS activists?
Yeah, I want to respond to that because the BDS movement here in the United States has been demonized, and indeed in many states are being boycotted and declared illegitimate by state governments at the behest of Zionist lobby groups like the American Israeli Aid Committee, Lobbying Committee, AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, AIPAC, is leading this charge, along with the Anti-Defamation League and other right-wing Jewish organizations. And they have, of course, and this has been going on since the days of the Black Panther Party, they have been trying to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. They have been trying, and they have been very effective with the assistance of the media, to paint anti-fascism and anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitic racism. Now, first of all, we need to understand that Israel is not a Semitic state, that the present rulers of Israel are Europeans. They're Ashkenazi Jews, and they come from Eastern Europe predominantly. They are not indigenous people. They are not indigenous Jewish or Sephardic Jews. In fact, they discriminate against Sephardic Jews, which are mostly Jews of color in Palestine and in North Africa. And anti-Semitism, it does not have any roots in the Black community or in communities of color. It has its roots in Europe, and it's evolved out of the Spanish Inquisition. And it was during the Spanish Inquisition, after the overthrow of the Moorish Empire in Spain, that the Muslim Empire in Spain, where Jews were considered equal to Muslims. There was no discrimination against Jews in Andalusia, in Moorish Spain. It was only after the expulsion of the Moors and the Muslims in Spain that the pogroms against Jews became institutionalized and spread across Europe. And so anti-Semitism has its roots in Europe, has its roots in the right-wing fascist governments of Europe. And it was for this reason that the Zionist movement evolved in Europe in order to find a homeland for Jews who were systematically and cyclically purged and hunted and demonized by Europeans. So having said that, the BDS movement, which arose with the occupation of Israel's and the boycott of the Gaza, the occupation of Israel is Palestinian lands by European settlers. We need to understand that Israel is a European settler state, and it was a European settler state that was established during the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, when Europe was trying, British and the French and Italians to a lesser degree were divvying up the Ottoman Empire. And the French are responsible for the contradictions in Lebanon and Syria, and the British are responsible for the contradictions in Egypt, in Palestine, and indeed even in Iran and further into India and the subcontinent. It was the British Empire divvying up the territories and drawing the borders and attributing a power to different elites that have led to the contradictions that we have today. So when the BDS movement is demonized in the United States as anti-Semitic, it's a bogus proposition. The BDS movement is a righteous movement of international solidarity against the white supremacist apartheid state of Israel. And the fact that governments, how would you say, support the repression, the marginalization, and the demonization of individuals and groups and organizations that have joined the BDS movement tells you that Zionism plus racism and equals the Zionism plus capitalism equals white supremacy and racism. And so any Black Lives Matter movement, any blacks in Europe who support the repression or engage in the repression of the BDS movement ostensibly because they consider it anti-Semitic, are themselves encapsulated organizations. And encapsulation is a technique and strategy of the nation state that encapsulate valid movements in order to derail them and to demonize them. So the Black Lives Matter movement, if it in fact supports the fascist, neo-fascist suppression of the BDS movement, themselves are agents of fascism, are themselves encapsulated organizations. And I'd like to know what type of black leaders or black spokesmen that you have there in Austria and in Germany who would attack the BDS movement along with crypto-fascists masquerading as anti-fascists. It's like Trump today who talks about fascism on the left. Fascism has never emerged from the left. It's always come from the right. And it always used white supremacy and racism as a fundamental ideology for organizing this xenophobic nationalism that's typical of fascist states. The first fascist state of Italy was xenophobic and it was expansionist. And it sought to reassert Italian control over the former colonies. The same way in Germany, the fascists were always warlike. They were always arose from the right. And they always used religious dogma to morally justify their attacks. In fact, the fascists of Europe, the fascists of Germany killed millions and millions of Roma people and Jews under the specious argument that the Jews were the ones that slaughtered Jesus, and that they were therefore anti-Christian. That they themselves were some of these vile, conniving conspirators like Judas that murdered Jesus. So we need to understand the confluence between fascism and religious dogma from the right, and how it's used effectively to suborn support from well-meaning Christians, from Christians who are not anti-Jewish, but to portray those who are opposed to the European settler state of Israel as fascists themselves, as anti-democratic people themselves. So this is about encapsulation. So if you have a so-called Black Lives Matter movement there that does this, then it shows you that the hashtag movement, Black Lives Matter, is a device of repression, is a device of co-optation, because it gives oxygen to the right to say all lives matter, to the police to say blue lives matter. So why are you focusing on black lives? It demeans and it denigrates the very idea that the Black Lives Matter activists want to institute or get across, is that people of color, black people, their lives have never been valued by the system, and their lives have never been valued by the state. And so this is why Black Lives Matter movement is a dead movement, is a dead end movement, because it has to say, because black people should and have to organize themselves into a black liberation movement. It's black liberation that matters, because black liberation has solidarity with the Palestinian people, with all oppressed people. And if you go back to the early days of the Black Panther Party, when we had a consulate in North Africa, that the North Koreans organized support for the Black Panther Party and for Black people against white supremacy and racism in the UN. When Eldridge Cleaver, as a representative of the Black Panther Party at that time, visited North Korea, Kim Il-sung, who was the leader of the North Korean people that time, issued a solidarity statement with to Black people in the U.S. who were suffering then in the 1960s, late 1960s and 70s, under severe police repression and the murder of activists. Malcolm X was killed, Martin Luther King was killed, dozens of Black Panthers were in prison, some were murdered, like Fred Hampton in their sleep by the FBI and local law enforcement. And Kim Il-sung sent a message of solidarity to the United Nations and to Black people with our struggle. Black activists don't know this today. They don't know that. So when Donald Trump talks about bombing or boycotting North Korea, they haven't got a clue. And this is the major flaw with the Black Lives Matter movement all over in Europe and the US. They have a very limited understanding of solidarity with peoples of color and with the bedrock ideology of the European nation state and the European settler states.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a special message to the young BDS activists here in Austria?
Yes, I think that our message is we have to stay the course, that we have to maintain that we cannot choose between a democratic fascism and an authoritarian fascism. They're both fascists. That we have to understand that capitalism is in a global crisis right now. And this global crisis has been mainly exposed or brought to the attention of people because of this pandemic. This pandemic has put people in the position of realizing that the governments that they thought cared about them, that the governments that they thought had their livelihood as their major concern was in fact didn't care about them at all. It only cared about them as far as they were consumers and getting them back into the marketplace. It did not care about their lives. That universal health care in the United States, for instance, people see now that it could be affordable. People see now that once the United States government decided to bail out the corporations and the banks, it pulled $3 trillion out of its ass and gave it to them. But at the same time, when Bernie Sanders' movement was talking about universal health care, the argument was, how are we going to pay for it? How do we pay for universal health care? How do we pay for universal education to public school education? These things now have been revealed to people. And I think finally, the thing that has been revealed to people around the world, whether they're in Beirut, whether they're in Beijing, whether they're in Jakarta or New York, is that the police are the armed agents of repression and the status quo. And that the police kneeled in their necks every day, just like they kneeled in the neck of George Floyd. And this is why people took to the streets everywhere in the world and said Black Lives Matter in China, Black Lives Matter in Jakarta, Black Lives Matter in Paris, Black Lives Matter in places where there aren't even Black people. So this means that this is an opposition, this is a new age of recognition that the world has to change, that the paradigms of power has to change, that the redistribution of wealth has to change, that the fact that only 5 white males can own 85% of the world's resources and control their economies is obscene. And that it has to change. Now, of course, the enemy and the national security states are opposed to such change. They're trying to bring back fossil fuels as the major source of the economies, of the basis of the economies in the West. But it's not possible. The planet is dying from the results of fossil fuel consumption. We have to have a new green order. We have to have a new world order. We have to have a redistribution of the wealth. And to close, in terms of biblical scriptures, that it was Jesus, I believe, who said that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And it's time for the last to step up and take positions as the first amongst humanity. And the revolutionaries and those who oppose fascism should lead the way and should maintain the course. Our sole objective today is to resist and organize. That's our objective. That's what we have to do. We have to stay the course. We have to resist.
Last question. Thank you, Dhuba. Last question. Today, we are also confronted with a new white power movement, mainly in Europe. It's a so-called identitarian movement. These are 2.0 hipster Nazis in nice fashion sportswear. They have reformed their old anti-Semitism by using now Israel as the role model for white supremacy. Can the answer be to such new ideological phenomena of white supremacy an own ideology based on pigmentation? Black power to black people, black liberation, black is beautiful, were historically never the answers to white liberation, to white power fascists, but for a change in society as a whole. Right?
Well, yes. This again goes back to what I was saying. If we were to integrate the police agencies, if we were to put black faces in high places in corporate structures, it will not change the function or the character of these institutions. It's not just a matter of race. It's also a matter of class. It's also a matter of that the economic system uses race to divide working people from each other, to divide the power and the political influence of working people. There are more people than pigs. There are more people and human beings who have compassion and humanity towards each other than there are fascists who view people as just an exploitable commodity. And we have to assert that. We have to understand that, yes, black is beautiful, but so is brown. Brown is beautiful as well. And we have to understand that white supremacy is a social construct that was based on the ownership of black bodies and the exploitation of black labor. That when industrialization came along, that chattel slavery was no longer useful to the industrialized and mechanized societies, that they had to have wage slavery. They had to have an educated or semi-educated working class in order to man the engines of industrial power. So we need to understand very clearly that we all have a stake in this struggle against fascism and against racism. Black, white, brown, we all have a stake in this because the national security state, whether it's manifested in China, whether it's manifested in Brazil or Europe, the national security state as it is constituted today is the enemy of all democratic loving people. And that they have to change this paradigm of power. We don't need national security states. We need an abolishment of these xenophobic national boundaries and national identities, because humanity now is a global village. What affects one affects us all. What affects this planet affects us all. And we have to come to a conclusion that this can no longer stand, that capitalism that has raped this planet can no longer be the economic engine of the world for the elite few, because it only creates wealth for the few and not prosperity for the many. So just basing a movement on pigmentation alone limits our ideology and limits our ability to understand that the liberation of black people and African people globally signifies the liberation of humanity. It's at the cutting edge of the liberation of humanity from the vestiges and the history of colonialism and capitalism. So power to the people, black power to black people, and death to the fascist pigs.
Thank you for this important last two sentences. We will understand this. Dhoruba, okay, thank you for the interview. Thank you for your time. Greetings from all in Dar al Janub. And we will see you in 1 month in Vienna, inshallah.
Inshallah.